Comic strip Switcheroo. The comic strip Switcheroo, also known as the Great Comics Switcheroony or the Great April Fool's Day Comics Switcheroony, was a massive practical joke in which several comic strip writers and artists, cartoonists, without the foreknowledge of their editors, traded strips for a day on April Fool's Day, 1997. The Switcheroo was masterminded by comic strip creators Rick Kirkman and Jerry Scott, creators of the Baby Blues daily newspaper comic strip. Overview. According to Brian Walker's book, The Comics, since 1945, 46 syndicated artists participated. Some of these switches were one-for-one, Mike Peters trading with Lynn Johnston, Scott Adams with Bill Keane, Jeff McNelly with Mort Walker, etc., while several comics did a multiple swap, including a 13-way swap. Also, one artist, Kevin Fagan, just swapped hands for the day, while the writer and artist for Sally Forth swapped roles for the day. Charles M. Schultz, creator of Peanuts, and Patrick McDonnell, creator of Mutts, were slated to do each other's strips, but backed out because one of them didn't think it was a good idea. Each artist was permitted to do what they wanted. The one-day experiment proved to be a success, garnering sub-publicity and being a harmless yet amusing prank played on the newspapers, the readers, and the comic syndicates. While characters making guest appearances in other comic strips is not an unusual occurrence, Dan Peraro's Bizarro and Stephen Pastis's Pearls Before Swine do it often. This was the most ambitious in scale. As of 2005, the phenomenon persists in webcomics, where internet cartoonists occasionally switch places with one another. Guest character tributes have also appeared since 1997, notably on May 27, 2000, and on October 30, 2005, both tributes to Charles M. Schultz and Peanuts. Subsequent similar events. On April 1, 1998, Jimmy Johnson published an Arlo and Janice strip in which the first two panels were blank, and the last two panel having Arlo imply that they were going to swap with Dagwood, but there was a misunderstanding. On April 1, 2001, a few years after the 1997 Switcheroo, Bill Amend, Foxtrot, made a Sunday strip in which Jason Fox, Andy Fox, Roger Fox, and Peter Fox exchanged looks. The referenced strips, Kathy, Hagar the Horrible, Boondocks, Doonesbury, Baby Blues, and Calvin and Hobbes, which had ended roughly 15 months before the original Switcheroony. On April 1, 2005, Stephen Pastis of Pearls Before Swine, Bill Amend of Foxtrot, and Darby Conley of Get Fuzzy all ran extremely similar comic dialogue in their respective strips, but with their own core characters saying the lines. On April 1, 2016, at least 50 webcomics, including Cyanide and Happiness, The Awkward Yeti, and Poorly Drawn Lines, all ran the same comic dialogue in their respective strips, akin to April 1, 2005. On April 1, 2021, Olivia James of Nancy and Steens of Art of the City swapped strips for the day. Strips and creators involved. The comics of April 1, 1997 were swapped as follows. 13-way swap. Baby Blues was drawn by Stephen Bentley. The characters have the same skin color as Herb and Jamal's stars. Herb and Jamal was drawn by Russell Myers. Broomhilda was drawn by Bud Grace. Ernie was drawn by J.C. Duffy. The Fusco Brothers was drawn by Jerry Van Armerongen. Ballard Street was drawn by Mel Lazarus. Mama was drawn by Jeff Millar and Bill Hinds. Mary Lou introduces Mama to Tank as her new boyfriend. Tank McNamara was drawn by Chip Sansom. The Born Loser was drawn by Brian Crane. Earl joins Thorny on a walk through a neighborhood. Pickles was drawn by Michael Jancy. Earl is really Norm in a costume. The Norm was drawn by Bill Holbrook. Wendy is at Norm's workplace. On the Fast Track was drawn by Jim Toomey. Just when you think Sherman makes a cameo, it's Wendy's hair. Sherman's Lagoon was drawn by Kirkman and Scott. Fish versions of the McPhersons visit Sherman and Megan. 11-way swap. 9 Chickweed Lane was drawn by Chris Brown. Lucky Eddie was one of Amos's ancestors. Hagar the Horrible was drawn by Wiley Miller. Hagar is visited by a systems analyst. Non Sequitur was drawn by Rob Armstrong. Jumpstart was drawn by Walker and Brown. Joe and Marcy see themselves like Hi and Lois. Hi and Lois was drawn by Greg Evans. Luann is Trixie's babysitter. Luann was drawn by Dan Peraro. Luann sees a cartoon chihuahua named Squeaky in her mirror. The shock slowly turns her into a bug. Bizarro was drawn by Billy Griffith. One of the women shown is played by Zippy. Zippy the Pinhead was drawn by Bill Amend. Zippy and Griffy have Jason and Peter's respective faces and are accompanied by Quincy the Iguana. Foxtrot was drawn by Brad and Guy Gilchrist. Jason, as Luke Skywalker, is fighting Darth Vader, who reveals himself to be Nancy. Nancy was drawn by Pat Brady. The animals Nancy performs for make the same happy expressions as Rose's characters. Rose's Rose was drawn by Brooke McEldowney. Nine-Way Swap. Beatty Boulevard was drawn by Ted Martin. Pavlov was drawn by Vic Lee. I Need Help was drawn by Lincoln Pierce. Big Nate was drawn by Scott Stantis. The Buckets was drawn by Jan Elliott. Stone Soup was drawn by Glenn McCoy. Val and Joan discuss their comic being drawn by a man instead of the usual woman. The Duplex was drawn by Delaney and Rasmussen. Betty was drawn by Dave Waymond. Reality Check was drawn by Bruce Beatty. Two-Way Swaps. Barney Google at Snuffy Smith was drawn by Hank Ketchum. Dennis helps Jughead with a Kick Me sign. Plus, Elvini and Louise resemble Alice and Mrs. Wilson. Dennis the Menace was drawn by Frank Laswell. Dennis's characters dressed like Snuffy Smiths for a group photo. Beetle Bailey was drawn by Jeff McNelly. Skylar got stuck at Camp Swampy. Shoe was drawn by Mort Walker. Shoe beats up Cosmo like Sergeant Snorkel would Beetle. Blondie was drawn by Jim Davis. Garfield steals one of Dagwood Bumstead's famous sandwiches. Garfield was drawn by Young and Blake. John and Garfield stay with the Bumsteads while their paint dries. Dilbert was drawn by Bill Keane. Billy visits Dilbert's cubicle. Family Circus was drawn by Scott Adams. Tell sports a PHB-esque hairdo, and Dogbert is her consultant. For Better or For Worse was drawn by Mike Peters. John and Ellie Patterson got stuck with dialogue balloons of the characters of Mother Goose and Grimm. Mother Goose and Grimm was drawn by Lynn Johnston. Edgar sneaks away to hang with the Mother Goose and Grimm cast. One Big Happy was drawn by Dave Coverley. Speed Bump was drawn by Rick DeTore. Ruthie and her family are in the background. Other notes. Kevin Fagan drew his creation, Drabble, using his left hand instead of his right, and the artist and writer behind Sally Forth switched roles for a day.